My mantra is the real painting is the one that isn't a painting. So that always keeps me level. It's like, stop trying to make a painting, make a test.
I'm always trying to take time in my art practice to experiment. It's always about figuring out what it is or where I might go next. When I do, it's so satisfying. It reinvigorates my art making. I love the idea of letting curiosity lead the way. What if your art was entirely experimenting? What if learning and curiosity were the primary informers of your art? How cool would that be? Meet Jaq Chartier. She's a Seattle-based artist fascinated with the experimentation of pigments, dyes, and color. She explores how paint and stains behave in the moment and, interestingly, over time. Her art, consisting of catalog, formal-like presentations of color tests, is beautifully offset by her saturated, soft, and hard-edged color stains. Her art is non-objective, but one can't help feeling the universality, the grand scale of the force of nature in her gorgeous art. Join me now for this fascinating conversation with Jaq. I think it will make you rethink your relationship with experimentation and curiosity. This is so good. To see Jaq's art, her links, and find out more, click on podcasts at www.art2life.com. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to Art2Life, a podcast for the creatively curious. My name is Nicholas Wilton, and each week I'll help you rediscover not just the art of your life, but the art in your life. Join me as we explore that perfect blue at twilight, the wild frontiers of art making, and the extraordinary joy of finding your way as you go. Thank you so much for finally getting this opportunity to talk and taking some time out of your day to share what you're doing.
Cool. Thank you for inviting me.
The way you work, and it's so fascinating to me. It's so material based. I love materials. I love the conversation between this is a painting and this is materials. And I explore that in my own work, but you really dove into this. And I think it's so interesting how you were a Golden rep, I think, and early on, and started playing around with materials, which led to all this work and all the testing, and this became your art. Can you just take us back to that period and how that all happened? I think it's like discovering your art through just experimentation. Totally.
I was actually part of what's called the Golden Working Artist Program, that Golden Acrylics trains artists who are full-time artists to go into all of the details of the materials, which are pretty extensive. I mean, I don't know if you've worked with acrylics or do you use oil?
Oh, yeah.
Use oil. But acrylics seem simple, but they are super complicated. And there's a lot of materials that Golden makes that are almost like you wouldn't realize they're available to solve different problems that artists have. And so my job was to study all the technical information and then translate it for artists to be able to use in their studio in everyday kind of way. And one of the things we would do is we made these little demo boards where you could show somebody, this is what it looks like if you use 1 coat of absorbent ground versus 4 coats of absorbent ground as a gesso primer, and how things worked on the surface. And I started making these boards that were for myself because students would ask me questions. I mean, there was a set that we were trained to make for the courses, but then there was my own stuff. And I was already making these organic abstraction paintings that were sort of a grid-based structure. And then the idea of these demo boards they started looking like paintings to me. It was weird. Something happened in my mind. And then this third thing happened. I was teaching a class for non-art majors, a drawing class, and I would really talk a lot about source material and how artists, it was important to gather images that you were just attracted to where you didn't even filter why. It's like yes or no. And I was making them keep a scrapbook of their source material. And these were not artists. And so I was trying to get them a fast way to tap into what they were interested in. And I could see it. Every week I would look through their sketchbook and I would say, what's in there? I was talking about source material, and I said, I had just seen on the news, the O.J. Simpson trial was on, and they had the images of the DNA electrophoresis on the screen. I didn't even know what it was called. I just saw that image and I was just like, was like, what is that? And so I was trying to describe it. And because it was non-art majors, there was a woman in the class who was basically doing electrophoresis that day in a science lab. And she pulled out a Polaroid of it and said, you mean this? And she gave it to me, and I have it. It's like it like launched the whole body of work. It's like everything came together. There's that synchronicity that happens when you have different ideas floating around, but they don't really line up. And then suddenly the missing piece comes in and bam, it just locks together. So I started making these paintings, right? Because the electrophoresis is a real test. There's something happening and there's an XY coordinate. So there's that grid. And it's also very organic, at least the ones back then. Now a lot of them are digital, which I don't like so much, but those were like organic and really amazing, beautiful.
And these would be used, well, like in the O.J. Simpson, like testing soil samples on shoes, or like?
No, they would actually they'd be testing your DNA as a person and comparing it to the DNA they found on an object. And the DNA electrophoresis is a way of separating out the different. I'm not a scientist enough to be able to describe this, but when you compare them side by side, you can see if they match or not. And I just liked the way they looked. There was something about it that brought me into a whole other level of making my paintings. And they were real tests. And so I was making real tests for the golden thing. And I got this idea about making the paintings be a real test. So making the painting is how you find out what happens. It happens in making the piece.
Right. It's just an experiment. It's just a test in and of itself.
And so all of my work, I have this rule now, and it's been going on for years, that every painting has to be a real test. It can't be just a pretty picture. And so I can't just gratuitously coat the whole thing with a transparent red because it would look beautiful, because then I can't read the test. So every element in the piece has to be there for a reason, and it's kind of stripped down so that I can actually learn something. And so each painting is kind of like a chart that I can study, and then I'll get another question and I'll follow that to the next thing. And so there's like this endless body of work as long as I'm curious. Now I'm curious at this level that you would call obsessive compulsive. Like I go down the rabbit hole in a way nobody else would. And I think every artist has that in some element of their studio practice where you're almost embarrassed. You're almost embarrassed to talk about it. But I think that's where you find that real spark of joy that you talk about, the thing that makes you excited, even though it seems like nobody else would care, but you care. Yeah.
And generally, or at least from my experience, it comes from moving the goalposts in closer, like it's you're narrowing, which opens up a whole world. I mean,
when you strip out a lot of stuff and you kind of say, I can't do that and I can't do that, and what's left, you kind of start kicking it around, like brainstorming and like, well, what about this? What about that? The other thing that's funny, at first I thought I was trying to get a handle on materials that were new, because I work with a lot of inks and dyes and stains that are all water soluble. And I've been painting for years. I started off as a representational painter, landscapes, seascapes. Then I went into abstract expressionism. I've used like lots of different materials.
Wow.
But inks and dyes and stains behave in a completely unpredictable way. And there's a lot more that can happen and a lot more that's out of your control. So at first I thought I was just trying to get a handle on the materials, but I found that every time I got to know too much about them, I would just find some way to subvert it. Like I'd throw in a new material or a different question, or I noticed something that was happening that I couldn't figure out why it was happening. And then that would just lead to a whole new bunch of paintings. So it was always the not knowing that actually drives the work.
God, I love that. I love that you're just making that the subject matter in a way.
I kind of can't help it at this point. It's like once in a while I'll pull out a bunch of, like I was watching a video of you painting and it's like really makes me want to paint again, like get the brushes out, because I use brushes to gesso and varnish and that's it. I use eyedroppers mostly now, but I miss the visceral painting. But when I pull out those materials and just say, I'm going to take a weekend and just, screw around with all these materials that I used to be so in love with, it just feels like, for me, it's like not calling me. It's not where I want to go anymore. But I can still love it when I see other people doing it. So,
what I love about the dyes and those watery materials is that they have such a unique look to them. They really are themselves. I mean, you see a John Singer Sargent watercolor, and he's just a master at controlling it. But it's still that watery. I mean, you're just exploiting. I mean, what happens with a dye when it runs onto a surface is got so much happening compared to like if we just squirted out some orange acrylic, you know?
Well, and right now I've gotten really obsessed with mixing two things together that don't want to stay mixed. The way that watercolorists would use like a sedimentary pigment and a more staining pigment, and you mix them together and you get that beautiful granular thing that happens. Well, I didn't used to think I could do that with dyes, but I quickly noticed that I do a lot of stuff where I bury the dye under other things and then they bleed back up, and they bleed up in different ways. And sometimes you'll get like a double halo of two different colors. Or I use, I think I've got about 80 different white spray paints, and each white spray paint has a different chemistry, and it will like be like an on-off. It'll block one color, but not the other. So if I mix almost all my colors are formulas where I mix up 2 or 3 different things, and maybe one color will stay buried under certain spray paints. It'll stay buried, and under others it won't. And so there's a lot of variation of what will happen. Also, like how heavy the spray paint is makes a difference. Like all of these factors, they're variable. Like a scientist would say, there's lots of variables.
Yes.
And for me, I'm always trying to stay a little bit ahead so that I can't figure out what's going to happen. Like there's just enough things going on that I can't really figure it out. So, I mean, I sort of think of it more, I actually feel like more like I'm a stage director, and the materials are my actors. So I'm sort of setting a stage for them, like setting the table and saying, okay, you guys do your thing, but then they do their thing, and it's out of my control at that point. And I come back the next day. There's the final step where I coat the painting with this white acrylic resin, and it starts off white, and then over a couple of days it becomes clear, and all of the interactions happen during that.
No kidding.
It's a custom formula that Golden makes for me that can coat my paintings the way I want, and self levels, like everything's flat. And so I leave the studio that day, and everything, it's like a Polaroid photo where it's like starts off white and then the image starts to emerge. And in fact, I have one in my coating room right now that I coated yesterday, and I won't know if it's it's either a great painting or it's a bust. And it's all or nothing. There's no going back. And so it's kind of feels risky because this is a commission and it's a short deadline. And there's always this like, oh no, I hope that nothing went wrong. I hope I didn't drop a giant hair off my head and didn't see it. You know, like something. So there's this out of control aspect that I really seem to need. Like if I know everything's going to happen, I can picture it in my head. I don't even want to make the piece. It's like I just get bored.
Yeah, I've definitely moved further and further that way. You know, and I call it emergent color, where I'm putting paint down and then I'm coating it and then I'm removing some of that top surface. But it's the way the paint comes through. It's just so much better than if I tried to put it on with a paintbrush. I mean, a paintbrush feels so crude, you know? So I totally get that.
Plus, you kind of maybe forget what color's under there sometimes, and it's like serendipity magic, where it's like, oh my God, I could not have planned that as good as it came out, you know?
Yes.
Like some part of your mind might know what's under there, but I don't know how our minds work. Sometimes I wonder if we actually do know what's going on some level.
Yeah, and you have a sense of this now. I mean, you've been doing it a long time. You know, it's like you can set up conditions that are going to create interesting results. You might not know what they're going to be, but, you know, I think there's that experience of like, okay, I'm creating this container for this something to happen. This is going to be interesting, you know?
Exactly.
What I love about your work, it's because your hand is kind of removed out of it, because you're kind of above it playing God. There's just something, I just love how it's like non-art. I mean, it's art, but it isn't, it's just of the earth, you know, it's got this sort of majesty. It's got this bigger sense to it because the paint is being itself, and the paint and how it's interacting is a universal. These are like, you know, there's erosion and, you know, things that the Amazon River does happens in your work. You know what I mean? It's like, they're big feeling ideas. When I try and do something, sometimes it feels kind of small-ish, and I try to I try to make it bigger and I try to make it more universal. And that's hard, but it's because I'm fussing with it too much. But you've found a way to stay above it. And God, I love that.
So when you say it feels small when you're making it, that's how I feel. I feel like I'm focusing on this minutia, like a little nerd in my rabbit hole, like digging a hole. And it doesn't feel big. It feels really small and very intimate and almost embarrassing. Like, why would anybody spend that much time on the same thing? So I don't know. I think the big part of it, I'm glad it feels that way to you, because it's like a micro macro thing, like an inversion that happens. Like there's this piece behind me, the group of four. I don't know if you can see them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like my current series is sun tests, where I'm making paintings that disappear. So I mix. So when I started making using inks and dyes, I realized that some of them were really not light fast. And so I kind of weeded those out. But over time, they've kind of caught my attention. And so I started making paintings where I would play with the fact that things were changing and disappearing. And the most current body of work, I literally have paintings in the window and I scan them as they're disappearing. And then the painting isn't what I show. I show these prints that are dye sublimation on aluminum. That piece, they're 37 by 37 each times 4. But the original painting is like 5 inches. And
oh, wow.
I can show it to you. I have it
amazing.
And it's almost completely gone. This is how it looks now.
Oh my
God. I don't know if you can see it. It's like
it's just barely there.
It's a ghost. And I'm going to make a time-lapse video of it. I've done one other time-lapse video of a painting just totally disappearing over time. And there's this thing about that that's really poignant for me, because there are these moments where I'll take the painting out of the window and I'm going to scan it and I just look at it and I just think, oh my God, I wish I could freeze this, because the painting itself is way more resonant than the print of the painting. And well, what I am doing is freezing it by scanning it, but I know that it's never going to be what the painting in real life looks like. It's always removed a step. And so there's a kind of wistfulness I have about that. Like, I'm the only one who gets to see it, but yeah, that's the power of it, I think, in some way. So
yeah, no, it's beautiful. And that the art is actually just changing. You've brought time into this work. I mean, we're so also cool. Like, we're so uptight about taboo. Archival,
Yeah, I was going to say, you'd think there's nothing you can do in painting that would make people uncomfortable other than sex or something. But a painting changing or disappearing makes galleries really uncomfortable. They're like, oh, how do I talk about this? How do I sell this? They're going to want to know what's it going to look like. I'm like, well, that's the whole point, is you're going to wait and see. So I can't sell a painting. I can't sell a painting that is going to totally disappear. I can sell one that has maybe one color that's going to change. I've actually started sneaking them in there. It's like there's one color that's going to disappear, but I won't tell you which one. So you're just going to have to look at it over time. And even that bothers people, which I find kind of amusing.
Yeah, well, there's some degree of uncertainty that you're selling that, not the most popular feeling for people,
Like everything in life is certain.
Yeah. And so I'm just curious, do you take that painting that is going to be changing, or you're going to expose it to the sun, and you have like an amazing scanner that you use? Yeah. Yeah.
I actually, another idea of the serendipity of how things align. I was thinking about this body of work for a long time before I made it. And I got this phone call one day from an art consultant. I was a project manager in the Bay Area. They were hired. There's this Merck building that went up a little while ago in South San Francisco, and they were hired. They were an animation studio. They were hired to find digital content for this media screen in the lobby. So they were animators, and they were looking for artists that had an art and science kind of feel, because Merck is, laboratory setup. So she called me, and I'm like, well, I don't do anything that's animated, but I have this idea that I've been kicking around for a long time to make these paintings that change over time and to document it, and we could animate that. And so they were like all in, and it was a really short turnaround, like 2 months, and it was winter in Seattle. The sun is not out. So I had to use photo lights, but it just kickstarted the whole thing. And basically I just decided I'm going to get a good scanner, and that I'm going to use like half of I didn't get paid a huge amount. It was mostly like I just wanted to definitely get it, because I knew if I didn't get the assignment, I would just drag my feet on it. But it gave me a deadline. which for me,
Yeah, no, absolutely.
deadlines are super motivating. And so I bought this great Epson scanner, and I can get super high resolution. It's amazing what you can see when you blow it up. It's pretty
Yes,
cool.
right. So you're taking that micro view and that's another transformation of it. Then it becomes large, which, I mean, I guess when I'm referring to the sort of universal truth of feeling or this bigness to your work, I'm talking about the organic changes in nature at play, big size on this work. And that is, like in my work, there's some of that, but there's also these other parts to it that are more me controlling things. But this is center stage in your work. And so that's what I was speaking to. So I know you might start out small, but when you drop into that and you see that the way that dye is spreading, and I mean, it's so beautiful. And it's like a river basin, or it's how a hillside when it rains and the mud comes off it, or any of those kind of processes that we see. Something about the color and the presentation of it, the formal presentation of it, elevates it into this sort of bigger frame. And you're making these are paintings, and they're very emotional and they move us. So what do you think about that? I mean, the formalization, the way you're presenting it, obviously I know you think about that, but can you speak to what's going on, how these things are becoming bigger than just like, oh, it's kind of like a smudge on a Petri dish. This is really powerful and almost symbolic and metaphorical, and we can see ourselves in it, and there's time in it, Is it just the scale, do you think?
I think part of it is at heart, I'm a sort of modernist painter, mid-century modernist aesthetic sensibility, very formal. I mean, I'm really thinking about the formal visual aspects of how the work's going to look when it's finished. So when I say I'm setting a stage for actors, I'm setting a very specific stage. And they're also really stripped down and pretty simple. So when it's that simple, sometimes you can actually see what's happening. Whereas if it was too much, like I was an abstract expressionist painter for a really long time, and I had these big fat oil bars, and I just like grind in there and use your whole body and make these giant things. And it was so much fun. It was really visceral. And then whenever I see painting like that, I could feel it in my body because I did it for a really long time. And it's a completely different way of working. And I could never have thought I was going to invent this. It just sort of happened in this slow process by just, again, following what I was curious about at a certain point. And it's like you're pulling on a thread and you're like, oh my God, now it's a rope. Oh my God, now it's a fire hose. You're like, it just gets bigger and bigger. But I think when you talk about feeling like you're controlling things in your work, I'm totally trying to control everything. I mean, every mark I make is with an eyedropper, which is really hard to control. And so I'm like, leaning over this painting for hours, or I can't touch it. Everything's got to be perfectly level. I mean, there's a lot of what I call constraints that I kind of sometimes go, why did I get myself in this corner? My back is starting to, as I get older, it's like I can't make bigger paintings anymore. But I don't know. I kind of, sometimes I tell my friends, I'm going to be inking this big painting for the next few days, and it's like prison time or island time. It's just going to take as long as it takes. And I just really slow down, and it just takes as long as it takes. But there's a point where sometimes I'm like, I wish I could get through this part really faster. But it's just the process requires me to work a certain way, and I just follow it. I think there's an aspect of resonance that I'm after that I think you were asking about that in a way. Like I'm looking for a certain kind of resonance when it's done. And so some pieces are failures because they just feel flat. So there's an aspect that I can't control, but I can edit and decide what I'm going to keep and what I'm not going to keep. What's going to survive through the natural selection process in my own studio practice, like what things survive and which things do I weed out, has really to do with, straightforward art world kind of concerns, like formalist concerns about what I want to see, what I like the looks of, that feeling of resonance that you might have in music. Like I listen to a lot of different types of music, but when I'm working, like creatively working and really having to think and use my whole brain, I'm listening to certain types of electronica, like Brian Eno, or something that's really trancy and kind of has a lot of flow to it. so that I can just really descend into that place, that you need to be in.
Yes, yes. Yeah. So for the painting to sort of make the cut, I mean, resonance and potency, and can you speak to what are the ones that, how you select it? What does it have to do for you for it to start becoming a keeper,
That's a really hard thing to pin down. I think because there are times when there are certain pieces that I still own because I really love them, but the gallery couldn't sell them. And it's like, I don't know why it's resonant for me and not for anybody else. And it almost doesn't really matter. If it's a really good painting, I'm like actually glad to get it back because there's always something in it I want to look at again. But I think sometimes if it feels too, I could never really explain it. It's like trying to ask yourself, why do you like this song and not that song? It's really personal. It's like there's like so many elements that have to come together for it to feel resonant or not.
Yeah. The way that I get to it is I look at several things, and it seems like you're doing tests and multiples, and it's like, well, I don't know, but that thing over there, the last one that's got something happening there, and so that's how I kind of find my way with it a little bit. It's just you can feel it on one of them, perhaps, that the others don't have.
Yeah. Well, I think the way that our brain processes images is really complicated. Like, how you can see a face one time and you can recognize it. And I think when you're looking at a painting, especially if you've been doing it a long time, I mean, you just like, for me, it's just yes or no. It comes down to that simple of like, I just follow the yeses and I move away from the no's, and I don't try to analyze it anymore. When I was in grad school, I had this moment where this kind of happened for me. And maybe it's the point where you stop being a student and you realize you're an artist now. It's like, there was a lot going on. There's visiting professors and there's crits and there's all kinds of students coming through, and we're getting closer and closer to our like MFA show. And I just couldn't hear my own voice anymore. I couldn't hear my own yes. It's like, is this my yes or someone else's yes or someone else's no? I just had to stop letting anyone in my studio. It's like, I think it was like 2 months. I just said, I can't have anyone in here. I got to let all this stuff clear out so I could just hear my own voice. And voice just simply being yes or no. This is for me. This is not for me. And it was really crucial. And those voices are always in there. We've got all kinds of critics in our mind, and we've got all kinds of thoughts about what the art world thinks we're supposed to be doing, what's in fashion. All of that stuff is swirling around all the time. And like the trick is to get it to shut up so you can just work.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's such a meditative process, your process. I mean,
parts of it there's a lot of craft in any painting, I think. And the craft part is really about getting from A to Z without messing anything up. So you can just get on with it, like varnishing. There's a lot of craft that goes into gessoing and preparing my panels. And I listen to podcasts and stuff when I'm doing that because it's not meditative. It's just rote. And in fact, the more I can just be relaxed and listening to something else and not being frustrated by how long it's taking, the better. But when I'm actually making the piece and designing the piece and all of that and figuring out which colors I'm going to use and mixing up new colors in the middle of making a piece, that's when I got to be like really having my whole brain.
Yeah. I do actually love those parts of my process that they're like, oh yeah, sure. Come on over. Let's have a conversation. I'm just doing X. And I love that. I love that part of it. And sometimes that's when some of the best things happen for me. But I get it, but when you were describing your back hurts because you got to keep this level and you're leaning over, gravity is this force in your work. I just suddenly realized, like, of course.
Except, so I was talking with a friend of mine who we both work in a similar way, working flat, and how the sense of gravity, normally in a painting, you think of it being top to bottom, but ours, because we work flat, is actually from the screen and then back into the wall. So it's like this gravity that's going back, and you can feel it. That's why it feels almost landscape-ish sometimes. It's like there's a space that you're trying to achieve, which I always find compelling.
Yeah, it's like there's this depth of that you're going into it or coming out of it. And
Right.
yeah, no, absolutely. And the colors that you're using, you were saying you kind of make these. Is it just intuitive, pretty much like, okay, do you begin the work and then, or are you doing kind of color studies, or are you just seeing what occurs and then adjusting to what's happening in front of you,
Well, I think the color is the most important thing that drives me. I mean, it's my sort of addiction. And so, sometimes it'll just be like, what mood am I in? I've got this LED light over my kitchen sink that I get up every morning and just decide what color do I want. I can mix up millions of colors. Like, what color do I want my kitchen to be today? So some of it's like that straightforward. But I mix up these formulas, and there's always these formulas that I know really well, and there's some that I don't, where like I just don't know exactly. I can't remember what's going to happen. And so sometimes I'll mix some of those in there. Sometimes it'll just be like, I need to make a painting with all my blacks so I can remember what they all do. But then the painting is a painting. Although my mantra is the real painting is the one that isn't a painting. So that always keeps me level. It's like, stop trying to make a painting, make a test.
Yeah.
Follow your curiosity.
Uh-huh.
For my work, that's the best I can do, is to not make a painting, which sounds weird. It's like letting the thing be what it wants to be instead of trying to fit into a box before you've even made it. Paintings want to be out there.
Yeah. And materials too, like I love it when, at least for my work, I like the materials to be doing something, but then I like them to retain their own aspect. And it's that more and more, that's the two things that I'm playing with. And I'm getting more and more interested in just the materials and what they're doing.
Yeah, I definitely feel that when I look at your work. I mean, again, I like to use the analogy of music. It's like, it's perfectly fine if you're a musician, to just play with sound and have layers of sound and things coming forward and things going back and patterns repeating. And you would never say to that person, well, why don't you have lyrics? Why isn't it about a person? Why isn't there a face in there? It's like, there's something about painting where more people are more attracted to paintings that have people in them and recognizable things than they are to abstraction. But as painters, I think we go down the rabbit hole of the materials because they open us up.
Right. There's more space to inhabit for us and the viewer, I think, for the right kind of viewer.
Right. The viewers who I think have a similar type of brain, like how your brain works. I don't know. I think there's some similarities.
Yes, I just got it. I just went down this rabbit hole the other day. It's actually for a podcast that's coming up, but I was asking people what the feeling and meaning of orange was to them. And it was just the most interesting thing, because people that, there's a certain kind of people that what they say is, well, I think of, tangerines and I think of oranges, and, they're looking out in the world and they're seeing the orange color. And then they say, well, that's what that is. And that's the feeling, because that's what I think of. And they're being truthful. And then other people are like, oh my God, it's like a whole different experience, and how it moves them and how they feel, there's an openness to orange, that there's a freedom to it because it's not male, it's not female. They can be, like, it's just really, really interesting that what colors we love can almost indicate who we are and how we think. And I don't know, I just see that definitely with the people that are attracted to my work, or when my work changed, you get a whole new crowd of people. And, there's a science quality to your work. There's a test quality, a lab quality, a DNA quality. And do you get people that are kind of, that have that analytical aspect, or is it not like that at all? I'm just curious, the people that speak of your work and are attracted to it.
People that have actually worked in a science lab and done electrophoresis or chromatography, they immediately come right over and go, is this chromatography? And it's like, no, I'm using a metaphor for it, but they recognize the language a lot. And like one guy in particular says, I should bring you all the electrophoresis like the ones that are in my trash can, they're actually failures because they have weird artifacts and they don't work as science things, because that's what I'm looking at, is those oddball things. But then I think you're right, though, that people respond to color in a very personal way. There's this poem, I can't remember off the top of my head who wrote it, but the title, I think, or the line is 50 reds in their minds. Like if you say the color red to a group of 50 people, there'd be 50 different reds in their minds. And I thought that was a great title for a show, but I haven't done it yet. And I think that with painters especially, if you say orange to me, immediately I've got like 40 different oranges in my head, not just one. There's like all these nuances to orange if you're a painter that you're aware of. And so it's like way more complicated. But I think you're right. People relate to the color by how it makes them feel in the world, how it makes them feel with objects in their day. It's not simple. People think it's simple, but it's really not.
It's so readily available. I mean, here's this thing that we're all surrounded by, color, and it's utterly abstract and it's filled in. Everyone's got a different perception of it, and their experience affects it, and who they are and where they live and all the cultures and all the things. And sometimes hard for people to get their head around abstraction, but color is that. And it's like, ask anybody, what's your favorite color? Oh, blue, and it's like, well, that's interesting. Why? I mean, why do you love blue? And it just,
It's funny you say that, because I pulled out this thing I wanted to show you. I've got this basket of little like quick ideas for paintings that I make when I'm in a real good. I
love those.
There are times when you're like, you have a lot of ideas clicking and you can't possibly catch them all. So I write them down. But there's this one I wrote that says, exposing people to the color blue can double their creative output. Blue.
Wow.
And
yes,
it's true. And actually, I read a lot about the brain and creativity and like the physiology of the brain. I'm really curious about all that. And colors have an impact on your body in all kinds of ways that are a lot more complicated than we realize. And so I think we're attracted to colors. Sometimes it can change on a daily basis just based on what you feel like you need. Like you need to absorb some blue for whatever reason you don't understand.
Yes.
So I find that interesting.
Yes.
But yeah, blue paintings always seem to do better than a lot of other colors. I don't know why.
In terms of success rate for
sales.
You, or just or sales. Interesting.
Outright sales. Yeah, I find it's really fascinating to study like what sells and what doesn't. I'm sure you've done the same thing. It's like, why that painting and not that painting, or why that whole like one after another of that type of painting versus other one, you can't move one of them. Also, like I have a couple of different galleries, and one of my galleries can sell certain types of paintings better than anyone else can of that type of painting, because she really loves that, like paintings with lines in them. And so she's like personally feels really connected to them, and so she can sell them. And no one else has that same level that she gets to.
Yeah, there's that, the enthusiasm that the person, they're almost like an escort for this painting, like, oh my God, do you feel this? And yes, absolutely.
Definitely.
I saw the really gorgeous installation you did for, I believe it was Microsoft in the lobby, or you were saying
the vertical one?
Yeah, the vertical one. Man, when the work just gets to that scale, I thought it was just extraordinary. How was it to work at that scale, and what was the takeaway for you from doing that?
Because it was glass, I didn't actually make the piece. I designed it, and I worked with a company called Meyer of Munich. They're a glass and mosaic fabricators in Germany. And I got to go there for a week and work with one of their master craftswomen she was fabulous. And every single thing there was sprayed on a glass paint that was real glass, sprayed on. And she basically repainted something I had made that we printed it out in inkjet full scale. And then she repainted the whole thing.
Wow.
And it was amazing. And so she had to kind of figure out how to translate what was happening with the ink. But with glass, it wasn't going to do that. So she had to make it look like that.
Oh my God, she did a remarkable job. I mean, she did an
amazing job. Well, at a certain point, I told her, I said, if you get inspired, like while you're making this thing, don't feel like you have to follow the letter of the law of the inkjet. Like if you get an idea, just go for it. She was an artist herself. And I wanted her to have that freedom to just run with something if it was working, and so she did a fantastic job.
And it's not so different, talk about setting up, curating and setting up some conditions. I mean, you're standing there over her shoulder and watching this thing happen. I mean, it's a little like what you do on your normal work, it's not so far removed.
I actually wasn't even there by the time she made the piece. I wasn't there. So it was completely out of my hands. Like, we did a lot of experiments while I was there to figure out different, technical aspects of how to reproduce what I was interested in. But then I left and she just worked on it herself, and I didn't see it again until it was installed. So
oh my God.
It was a very weird process for me, because I'm usually right in there rolling up my sleeves with the gloves and making everything. To let go of it that much was kind of like, whoa, I could do this again.
That is so cool. Well, and talk about this, what you were saying, you put that finish on the work and then you come back 2 days later and it's getting clear and surprise. I mean, that's the same thing with this. They're installing it and you get to see it for the first time. Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, because I was afraid, what if it just feels flat? What if it just doesn't, and it's such a big piece that it could be a big failure, but she pulled it off. Thank God.
That is so cool. Well, I work with a lot of students and getting them to kind of find their way, and definitely tracking what brings wonder and following curiosity and surprise. And I just love how you've just moved that. That's your roadmap that you're using. And
totally. Yeah, I kind of feel like my bumpers on the side of the road are boredom on one hand. Like, if you're bored, you're not in the game. And if you're scared, or you're, almost any emotion other than joy, like you like to use the word joy, which I really love, then you're not in the game. You're kind of like, up in the stands watching the game, but you're not playing it. If you're playing it, you're not thinking about any of that stuff.
Yes. I love that. I mean, that's so good, because there's a lot of mental anxieties and worries and trying to figure out things ahead of time. But when you're actually making art, it's none of those things. The thought of doing it is a bit sickening, and sales or whatever, and a rejection. But truly what you're doing is you're in that more joy, open space, and just go do all that all day. I mean,
Well, I think that the mistake people make, especially when they're first starting, is they think they're going to have that joy thing all the time. And you have to put in the work. I mean, there's a lot of work involved. It's just, so you have to find things that you enjoy the activity of, so that you can stick it out. For me, I like certain things. I don't like other things. And so it kind of gravitate towards an activity that you can sustain over a long period of time. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon.
Yes.
So you have to find your materials. You have to find your colors. You have to find your subtle. Like, one of my friends just loves ink on paper, like small drawings on paper, and she keeps trying to figure out ways to scale it up. And it's like, that's her thing.
Yeah.
And if you try to force it to be something else, then you lose the very thing that you fell in love with. You know what I mean? She's worried that she needs to make the work bigger, or it needs to be a painting and not a drawing, or there's all these things that the art world tells you, and it's like, you're the boss. You got to set your own path. It's hard to stick to. And I think even more so for women, because I don't know if you talk much about how women are different than men in the creative process, but I have this group of women. We call ourselves the ass kickers. It's like we're kicking ass and we're kicking each other's ass. And we talk about, because we're all older and middle-aged-ish, and trying to figure out when do you consider yourself a master at what you're doing, instead of always trying to at what point, you would never tell an artist who's a master, when are you going to make something different? When are you going to change and stop repeating yourself, or whatever the things are that go through your head? If you consider someone a master, they're making what they make. And it's you don't ask them, why are you still doing that?
Yes.
And I think women artists are always trying to please people in one way or another, even if you don't admit it. Inside, it's churning around. Does my dealer like this body of work as much as the last one? Or if it's not selling, are they judging? You're thinking about all this stuff. And so we talk about how to get more of the sort of cowboy swagger of like a 24-year-old male, like who just kind of makes their stuff and it's like, take it or leave it. And we have to
Yes,
have more. I think
yes.
we need more of that in the studio.
I love that. I mean, that is so interesting. And I can imagine, and I know the serving others role that women are always playing and taking care of people. And, and I work with a lot of women and, most of the time they have to postpone because they're looking after other people. And it's just really hard for them to get that clear voice of what they want to do for themselves. But what you're describing, the second guessing, it's in all of us. I mean, in the men as well. But I think what you're speaking about more is that fire of just, like really bringing what it is you're here to do, on the planet and just leaning into that and learning how to stay in that, and not second guessing. I mean, it's just, you're just so in it. And I'm really interested in that. And I try to teach that, and I'm trying to learn that and talk to people about that constantly. It's just sort of I think there's a way of approaching life and art that is that, wow, you can just do so much,
What percentage of the people you work with are women?
Probably at least 75%. And I don't know exactly the reason, but this isn't, this is played out. When I talk to everybody, I know people that are teachers and run workshops. And it seems like that there's a willingness that women have, I think, to raise their hand and say, hey, hey, show me something, an openness to learning that, it's like asking for directions. Men will just drive and drive and drive and drive. I mean, I know this about myself. It's like, I'm not going to ask. I think I'm going to figure this out, and we'll just drive and drive and drive and drive. I mean, me learning to ask for help is a real triumph. I mean, I used to do everything myself, and it's really something I'm proud of. Like when I remember to do it, like, God, I should have just asked. I did it that time. I asked, how to do this or what do you think of this? And it always helps. So there's a kind of a mix. I mean, there's the downside of just, always having to second guess yourself, but there's some really amazing things that happen when you involve the collective and you think a little beyond yourself, and you have a kind of consciousness about how you're coming off, how you are in the space, that you can check in with people, and that awareness. So it's an internal awareness and an external awareness. And there's a balance of that. And I think it relates to art making. I mean, how you were describing, how do we know what's a strong piece of art? I mean, I can kind of feel it, but it's feeling it, how it speaks to the world, not just me.
Well, and I think for women and for all artists, like having a sort of confidence at a certain point that you are kind of ahead of everyone else with your work. So they're looking at what you've made in the past and responding to it, but you're making the new work. And at some point you have to have confidence that even if you're going to change your work or try something new, that you have to do it, because you won't know until you make it if it's a path that you're supposed to go on. It's like you have to be willing to hack through the brush and have it not be easy or explainable or predictable or sellable, like all those things, if you're going to get to the next body of work. And you have to take the patience to go through that process. Like when I started my testing series, the first, I'd say 2 years of shows that I had were really kind of all over the place and rough. And it took a little while for that body of work to like get organized, where it became something really that had some traction. And thankfully I had an art gallery at the time, an art dealer who was curious, like just like me. And he was like, go for it. Let's just see what happens. Instead of like, oh, I want you to make the same work that we already know will sell.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, I was lucky because I was kind of young. And sometimes when you're young, you'll take the advice of a dealer too much if they're trying to steer you into making a certain thing or make more of that thing. And that can be really detrimental to the process that you need to follow to get to the next body of work. So it's like, you got to be really careful who you actually, like you can listen to everything, but you got to take care of what you let in terms of steering yourself.
Yeah, that's really great advice for sure. And I think, in kind of in wrapping this up, I mean, I get a lot, I know a lot of people who listen, who are really trying to put this together. You talked about that. What are the materials you love? What's a practice that can be part of this that's sustainable? I mean, what would be your sort of advice for folks that are trying to kind of like synthesize things down? I mean, you've given us a lot of information around that, but just sort of in any thoughts to how you, knowing what you know now, would take that on?
I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I got when I was in grad school that really helped me was a visiting artist who said, think about writing a sentence instead of writing a novel, like a painting as just a word instead of an entire novel. Because I was really you're trying to say everything you know about painting in every painting. And it's like this massive struggle. And you're like, it's never right. And it's like writing an artist statement. You got to keep writing it over because it's never right. And when I started thinking about each painting as a brick in a wall, as opposed to the whole wall, or a sentence instead of a whole novel, it just took off so much pressure, and it allowed me to play. And it's like, you don't have to have everything you're going to do in each thing. It could be a facet of it. And like trying on a coat, and you try on this coat, then you try on that shirt, you try on these boots, you see what you want to wear again and what feels good over time. But you have to be willing to just have fun with it. And also just the simple yes, no. I mean, to me, I always come back to that. It's like, don't even analyze it. Is it a yes or a no? Like, boom, boom. And try to get back to where you can really feel it in your body that's yes or no. And then follow the yes. Like improv. Yes, and.
Yes. I love that. And I love the simplicity, the spaciousness that creates. I mean, my whole body relaxes when I think of that.
Exactly.
I mean, We've all tried to fill in too much stuff. It's like trying to explain yourself. You're at a party and you're trying to tell people all about your work, and you leave the thing and you feel like crying because it's just, you can't do it, and it's too much. It's just too much. So that is just beautiful, really beautiful advice.
If you're a musician, you wouldn't try to explain your music. You just let them listen to it. Like, listen to it. It'll say it for me.
God.
And painters, we're not writers. We're painters. So like words do not help us.
Wow.
At least not very. Maybe poetry can help us. That's about it.
Yes. Well, poetry is a perfect metaphor, visual poetry, and that, in a way, that's what I kind of call my work. They're just poems, and that gives me that spaciousness. Yes. Listen, thank you so much for this time. It's just really, wow. I've actually gotten so much from this conversation. I've got all these notes here.
Actually, I have one more thing I want to say before we go.
Yes, please.
There's a book that I found. I'm always like telling people about this book. It's kind of an odd book called Fire in the Crucible: The Alchemy of Creative Genius, which might be off-putting to people, by John Briggs.
Okay.
It's an amazing book. I open it at random anytime I'm feeling stuck or like I'm feeling like I'm not an artist. And I'll read something in here and go, it just makes sense. He talks a lot about the aspects that artists have where they're lazy but completely ambitious, or they're introverted and extroverted, and male and female. And it's like all these aspects about the creative process, and writers, musicians, dancers, painters, like scientists. It's an amazing book. I don't know why more people don't know about it, but it's fabulous.
Wow.
So I just had to put that.
Thanks for that. We'll provide a link in the show notes for that as well. Real quick, what's coming up for you do you have some shows coming up, or where can people maybe see your work? And we'll provide links to your galleries and everything, but do you have any shows coming up?
Actually, right now, I'm blessed that I don't have anything scheduled, because I have some space on my calendar to just like play around. I needed some space, so I've been kind of putting off scheduling anything. I have a couple small commissions, but I'm really trying to create some space to just make some new things and let it go where it's going to go without a deadline. I think deadlines are motivating, but they can also kind of hem you in. So
yes.
Right now I need that space to kind of try some new things that might not pan out and just see where they go. So I'm hoping I can keep it that way for a little while.
Sounds beautiful. Well, again, listen, Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Art2Life show. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help me get the word out by sharing it with your friends on Instagram at Art2Life_world. The recording of this and all episodes, along with a place to leave comments, see additional photos, and discover a whole new approach to making art, can be found by going to Art2Lifepodcast.com. And secondly, if you could leave a rating and review in whatever app you're listening on today, I would super appreciate it. It makes a big difference. And last but not least, before you go, if you'd like to be on my artist list, every Sunday morning I send out a video blog all about art making. Go to Art2Lifepodcast.com to sign up. And all these links are in the show notes, of course. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.